Now, if you watched the previous vlog entry about Gaunt's Ghost, you know that I'm getting extra use out of these guys. I finished one vlog, turned the camera off, turned it back on, and starting the next one. The focus of this one, as I've gone through painting these, I've tried to do it in, okay, let me do it how I see many painters doing it. I've always felt that if you want to get better at something, you look at how the people who you respect do it and emulate that. You don't, you may adjust it, you may find what you like and what you don't like, but you emulate that. And as I've gone through this project, one of the things that I've done is made use of wet palettes to a much greater extent than I ever have before with any project. Now, if you'll pardon the brief handheld shaky cam segment, you can see here's where I'm working, and these are all the paints that I've used on this project. I've kept them out so that I had them easily at hand to grab. So I've used a lot of paints in doing this project. Now, of course, what many painters, and by many I mean M-I-N-I, miniature painters, not M-A-N-Y, what miniature painters talk about when they discuss using wet palettes is you can put your paints on there, and you can, I can take these are colors that I've been using for the cloaks and other things, and I can put a little bit of each of them on there, and I can do blends between the colors, and I can put the colors on there straight, and I can do them thick, I can do them thin. There's a lot of great things about using a wet palette, and all of those I'm glad I did it. I've never had to be convinced that a wet palette made sense. It just always made sense to me. It's just that a lot of projects, because I tend to do things single colors at a time, and I use them straight out of the pot, I just didn't use a wet palette very often, just for practical reasons. But because of needing to blend on here a lot more, I've been using them. I started off using this, you can see that the foam is all dried up, and it's a little bit mildewy. But I started off using this one from Army Painter. I like the foam that comes with it. It holds water really well, but it's really thin. Works good. It comes with its own paper. I don't like the paper. I've heard a lot of people say it's too thick. I guess I don't know enough about it to be able to judge that. But what I didn't like was, even though if you take the dry paper and put it in here, it fits perfectly, apparently when you put water, the stuff expands to the point that I've got to cut like a 1/4 inch off all around to the paper that comes with this. And it just gets to be a pain before I can use that. Otherwise, it's coming up on the edges, and it doesn't get wet, and it's curling up. And the other thing I didn't like about this Army Painter palette is, once I got the paper cut and everything was going okay, it worked well. It didn't take, I'm messy with these things, it didn't take too many colors before I had the whole surface filled up. And all of the benefit of a wet palette, being able to put the lid on it and maybe even put it in the fridge and then come back the next day and you've still got your paints and you can add more to it, was completely lost, because by the time I'd come back the next day and wanted to go to a whole nother group of paints, as you saw over here that I was using, I had to just take the paper off and start over. So it was like every day I was having to rebuild the wet palette because I was using more colors, and I just didn't have enough room on it. So I've kind of, as you can see, I've just kind of let this thing sit aside and dry. I don't know that I'll use it that much more, at least not, maybe for smaller projects because it doesn't take up so much space, but it just hasn't, the amount of space on this thing and having to cut the paper just hasn't really endeared this to me. So about maybe about a third of the way through the project, I decided to go with the Marco Frazzoni method, the homemade method, and use a box of chocolates. Now, this, of course, brings its own benefit in that you get to eat a box of chocolates. He does a great video, you know, when he's talking about how do you make this pallet, and he's like eating chocolates, and he's got his mouth full, and he says something like, step away. If you've ever heard, I'm not making fun of him. This is how he talks. He's got a very strong accent. You know, he's like, step one, eat the chocolates. And I'm like, that's awesome, man. So, you know, I got to eat some chocolates, but, and this box, the size of this thing is great. I mean, here's the Army Painter palette, and you know, this thing is square. This thing is like, let me see, 12. It's over 8 inches square, so it's got plenty of space on it. The problem I ran into here, I needed to put something in the bottom, and I grabbed some of these. He suggested some of these Swedish how come every time I say the word Swedish, I want to go Swedish? I want to sound like the Swedish chef. We start talking like Andy Butcher from Sweden. But sorry, Andy. But I tried those, but they have a texture on them, and I used both sides, and I cut out some parchment paper, but the texture only contacted the surface, you know, in it didn't make full contact with the surface because of the texture, and so it didn't wet the surface properly, and I couldn't use that. And I tried to find some other, you know, those reusable dishcloth things to make use of, but nothing I could find didn't have that texture, so it wasn't flat. Well, so I went with this chunk of foam that I use. This is actually my chipping foam, and cut it the right size. Now, this worked. I cut a piece of parchment paper and put it over it, but because this foam is so thick, I had to this thing just had a huge amount of water in it, and so anytime you touched it, it was sloshing around, and you know, was just quite impractical in terms of that. Now, I used it for almost all of the project, and it worked really well. And when I finally cleaned the thing off the other day, just because I had so many paints on here, the paints were still viable after a week. There was some of the reds that I was literally they would kind of separate, and I'd stir them together and use them a week later. So it did what it was supposed to do. But you know, I was wishing that I could find some foam like this to put in here, because this would have been perfect with that. But it was just, this just made it a little impractical. So the last day, I've just gone back to my old dry palette. You know, I mean, it works. It has worked for me for years. Mark Sarastro, Duncan. I mean, you know, everybody still uses dry palettes at times. And as I've just been doing touch-ups, I just put some colors in here and paint with it, and it works for me, and I get along. But I'm going to try, I think I'm going to order one of those Masterson palettes off of Amazon, and I've seen a lot of miniature painters talk those up. Now, that, you know, some of them will say, you know, they use the Redgrass Games and all those that are, you know, $50-$60. But a lot of them say, look, you can't go wrong with those Masterson palettes because they're inexpensive, they work, they've got just a simple kind of sponge at the bottom that works, the paper works. Some are a little critical of the paper, but, you know, I figure I can live with it. But I found one that is a little wider than this one, not quite as tall, but the surface area is about the same, because the surface area really worked for me, having a lot more space. So I think I'm going to try one of those. But it's been an interesting project in terms of what I've learned about using wet palettes for an extended period. So it's still, even in that, it's a learning process.